Hello guys and welcome back. In this video we are going to learn about services in Android and how to create them and use them. So a service is among of the core components that helps in executing long-running tasks. So the service class is important in several cases. So for example, when you're creating a music player app, we want to allow the user to play the music even if it's going to move out of the application. Or for example, if we are having an audio recorder, we want to continue to record the audio even if the user is going to navigate off the screen. So there are different types of services that serve a different purposes. Now let's start with the background services. Okay, now let's create here a new class and we can just call this my service. So this class is going to inherit from the service class. So a background service is just a service that performs actions that are not noticeable by the user. So for example, when we compact our database, this is not directly related to the user interface. So the user is not going to be noticing if we are going to save to the database. And there are several restrictions which are imposed to higher level APIs. For example, from API 26 to more, there is restrictions to these background tasks. Now let's implement several callbacks so that we can make our service ready and running. So we can just press Ctrl I here to implement this onBind method here because it's just a must. But for now, we are not going to use this. We are just going to return null, and then we are going to see this later how we can use this method here. Okay, now in order to start the service, we have to override another method, and this is just called onStart command. And this method here is going to take up several parameters here as we are going to get the intent. So we are going to start the service from the main activity here, and then we're just going to come back to this service, and here we are going to receive an intent which we can try to execute and get some other commands which we can just use them here on start command. And on start command here is going to execute indefinitely until when the application is going to be killed, for example. So even if we go to the background, then user is going to quit the application, then goes to another application, this is going to be executing. So we have to stop it by ourselves. Okay, now here we don't want to return this super.onStart command, and this one is going to return another thing, so we can just write here return, and here we can just specify start sticky. And this one is going to tell up the service that when it's going to be killed by the Android system, that it should not return or get another intent, otherwise it's going to return here null, and then it's going to execute our command. And for if you want other things, you can just go to the documentation. They have a lot of these constants which you can try to reuse them in order to suit your needs. Let's just print here a log statement, so we can just write here log I, so we can just write here service, and we can create here a private variable. And now here what has been left is just starting this service here. So for this case here, when you use this onStart command, we can just come here to our main activity, and now we can just launch up the command. Okay, now let's create here a simple UI that is going to help us to launch up the service. So we can just come here and create a little bit of space here. Now down here we can just create our composable, and here we can just call. And basically here just we're going to create a row. Now after we fill here the max size, now we can pass in here the horizontal arrangement, and we can make them to space evenly. And for now here we can just create two buttons, and here we can just call this start service. And here we can just change this to stop service. So basically we have here our two buttons. So we can just expose this method on click here. So for example, here we can just call this on start. And here we can change this to on stop. Now here we can just invoke our on start method. And basically here we can just call my buttons, and here we have our on start, and inside here our curly braces we have just the on stop. We can just keep it inside here, so on stop service. Okay, so inside here now we can just start our service, and in order to start a service we can just use an intent, and here we can just pass the main activity, And then here we are just going to pass the service class, and here is just my service. And also here now we can just call start service, and then we can just pass it here. So for this case, because we are just starting this service from here, we have to stop it. And to do that also, we have to use the intent in order to call the stop command. And here we can just call stop service. And then we can just pass in the intent here to it, so that we can easily start and stop our service. Now, after we create here our intent, we have just to come here inside the manifest file in order to register our intents. Now we can just come here below this activity. So we can just add another tag here, which is just called service. And as you can see, it's going to suggest here our service name. We can just close this anchor brackets. And for that case there, now we can try to run our application and see the output. Okay, now let's press here start service for now, so that we can just start the service, and we can just come here to the log cut, and we can just filter here my service. And as you can see here, this is just going to call the services started. And for this case here, our service is just running indefinitely until we kill our application. Now we can just demonstrate this by seeing that when we are going to be printing. So we can just come here to my service class, and then we can just navigate to this here log cut, and then we can just use the while loop. So we can just while true, then we are just going to print this log tag here. Now let's run our application again and see the output. Now let's press start here, so that we can just start our service. And when we come here to our log cut, you can see that it's going to print indefinitely here. And this because we have just a infinite loop here, and then it's going to loop up around. Now this case here is going just to heavy task our thread, because service is going to run by default inside the UI thread, and for this case here our application is just going to fail to respond. Now in order to solve this, you have to use, for example, something which is going to go up to another thread. So if we come here, you can see just our service is just not going to respond, and here we can just kill it. And for this case here, we have to use something which is just going to go not inside our UI thread. And for this case, you can just use a handler, for example, and loopers, which is going to execute this inside another thread. Or you can easily just use coroutine. And for our case, we're just going to use a coroutine so that we can just execute this inside another thread. Okay, now here just let's create here a letInit variable. And here we're just going to call this job. So for this case here, we want to come here inside our onStart command here, and we can just initialize our job, and we can just use the main scope, and we can launch a coroutine so that we can just easily access here. So for our case here, we can just copy this and we can paste it here. So for example, here now we can just add, for example, delay. So we can just delay here for 100 milliseconds, and then we are just going to be printing here. So every 100 milliseconds, this one is going to be delayed, and then we are just going to print here a log cut. And we can just easily kill here our job. So for example, here we can just come to the onDestroy, and easily we can just use this job.cancel. And we can cancel here our job if it is just still executing here. Now let's try to rerun our application, and then for now we are just not going to get the error. Okay, now let's press here start, and we can just see here inside our log cut that is going to be printing every time. And for this case here, it is just because we have used that job, and then we are not going to just get an error, and we can easily even interact with our UI. So for our case here, we can just stop the service. And as you can see here, our service is just going to stop. And also we can just restart again our service. And for this case here, even if we just go outside the application, you can see that this is just going to be executing. And for this case here, we have to stop the service manually, or we can just call the way which it can easily stop the service. So for example, if you're just compacting the database, the user is going just to start this, or it's going to be started automatically. So you want to stop the service to run. So you have to use a way which it can easily stop itself when it finishes to execute. Now for this case, we can just come here, for example. So while this one, so we can just change this. So we want to display here, for example, 5. So we can just create here a counter. Then we can just use this counter if this counter is going to be less than 5. And we can just print up here, and then we can just increase our counter for this case. And for this case here, now we want to, for example, stop this command here if it finishes to execute this 5 times. Now to do this, we can just easily call stop self. And for this case here, after finishing to execute this 5 times here, it's going to stop self. So for example here, if you have something which you are just going to execute it, it's going to execute first, and then it's going to finish up by calling this stop self when it has just finished, for example, just to upload the picture to the database. Now let's try here to rerun again and see the output. Okay, now let's press here start service. And as you can see, after finishing 5 times here, it's going just to stop automatically this service here. And this is just because we have used stop self here in order to finish up. So for example, if you are just uploading things to the database, so we want to stop this after we finish up. So guys, this is how you can easily create a background task that is not noticeable by the user and perform tasks on the background. Now let's create a foreground service, which is a service that a user is aware of and sometimes can even interact with. So by default, we have to show a user notification that there is a service running and is using resources, so that if a user wants to kill up the service or is going to just delete it. Now let's see how we can create a service. Okay, now let's create here a new file which is going to hold up our foreground service. So we can just call this foreground. And as usual, this must inherit from the service class. And also we have to override on bind method, and here we are just going to return null. And then again here we can just override on start command here, and we can just return start sticky. And for this case here, because we have to show a notification, now we have to create a notification. And for this case here, we can just come here below and create a notification channel that we can just use it to create our notification. Okay, now let's create here a private function, and we can just call this create. And this method is going to take up a context, and then it's going to return a string. Okay, now here we can just create several parameters which we want to use them. For example, here we can just create our channel ID. Okay, now here we can create our channel notification, and we can just use here our notification channel. And here we can just pass in the channel ID. And we can use the notification manager, and we can set it to importance high. And here we are just getting error, so we can just add the annotation, and this is just called requires API 26. So when we add this annotation here, it's going to finish up that error there. Now we can easily customize here our channel, so can just use this apply, and for example here we can just pass in the color, and we can set up, for example here we want to use blue, and we can pass in here the importance, and here we can just set it to the importance high. And also here we can change the lock screen visibility. So here, for example, we don't want when the notification is going to show up inside the notification, so we can just use the notification and set it to private here. Now for that case, we have to register here inside our service, so we can just get here our service, and we can use here the context compact, and we can use .get system. And for here we can just pass in the context, and here we can just pass in the service class. So here we can just call the foreground service, and here we can just get service. And also here we have to pass in a null check, and here now we can just use the context notification service, and we can use this as notification manager. For this case here, now we have our service, and now we can just create our notification. And here we can just pass in our channel, And for that case here, now we can just return our channel ID. Now here our method is just ready to use. Okay, now let's come here to onStart command and finish up the creating the notification. So we can just create here a little room. And the first thing which we want to get the channel ID. So here we can just call the create notification channel which we have created and pass in this here. And we are just getting error here, and as you can see here, call requires API level 26 to more. So we can just add a notation, or we can just come here to more action and we can surround this with if check else. And so here we are just going to check up if this one is just going to be greater than API level 26. So we are just creating a notification channel. Otherwise we have just to provide here an empty, because this one is not required when we are just using below API level 26. Now for that case, we can just create here now our channel builder, so that we can just build our channel. So we can just create here a val, and we can just use the notification compact. And here now we can just pass in this, and then we can just pass in the channel ID. So by the context, and then we are just passing here the channel ID. Now we have to create the notification itself. So we can just create val notification, and then we can just call the notification here, notification builder. And for this here, we can just customize this. For example, you can set the smaller icon. And here we are just going to use the normal icon. And also here we just have to set this ongoing. And we can set this to true. So that is just going to be shown endlessly, because this is just required. And after that, now we can just set the priority. And we can just set the priority to be mean. And then here we can just set the category. And we can pass in to be the category of service. And now here we can just set up the set content title. So here we just set the title, and then we can just set the content text. And we can just call here build. And now here we can just start our foreground service. And this one requires us to pass in two parameters, the service ID and also the notification. And here, for example, we can just pass any ID which you want. And for our case here, we can just pass in the notification which we have created there. And now here on the part of the notification, we can just start our foreground service. Okay, now to start this service, we can just come here to the main activity, and we can change here. So instead of passing here inside the onStart, instead of passing this my service here, we can just pass in here the foreground service. And now we can just start here the foreground service, and we can just call here start foreground service. And then we just pass it, and here we are just getting error, and here also it requires us to run from API level 26. And here we can just pass in the if else statement, so we can check if this one is going to be level API level 26, we can just start the foreground service, else we are just going to start the service. And we can just pass it here in order just to start that service. And basically here now we can just stop the service, we can just pass in here the foreground service, and we can just pass in stop service here. Okay, now before we run our application, we can just come here to the Android manifest file here, and we can just register also our service. So we can just pass in here service name, and we can just pass in this foreground service here in order to register it. And now we can just go back to the main activity and rerun our application and see the output again. Okay, now let's click here start service, and then when we come here to the notification tray, you can see that we have my foreground service and we have just started this service. And when we come here and press stop service, and then also we come here, you can see that the notification is going just to disappear. So this one is going to be visible to the user, and even if we just go off the screen, so we can just see here our service is just running. And for that case, until we come here and then we stop our service. So for example, here you could be accessing location for the user, and then you are just going to let them know that we are just accessing the location by using this service here. So far so good, we have managed to create background and foreground services. However, we cannot communicate with the activity, so we cannot send the data to the UI layer. So here comes in the bond service, which helps in binding activity component to the service. So in the next video, we will see how we can share data from the service to the activities. So for now, we can just leave it here. So if you find this video helpful, please don't forget to provide a like and provide a subscribe. See you in the next video. Bye bye for now.